We're back on the record. It's 10:57 a.m. and this is take 2.
Could you hand me Exhibit 26, please? Mr. Gerrity, this is the part where I wish I'd tabbed some of these things earlier now that I look at the size of this exhibit. I'm going to represent to you that this is essentially an entirety of a folder that we got from Mr. Hartman, and it was titled AIU and FPU Acquisition, Negotiation, Investigation, Miscellaneous. And so if you look at the way you're holding, it'll be the upper right-hand corner where the Bates labeling is. There's just a couple of specific questions I'm going to ask you about this particular, some of the things included in his file. The first one I want to ask you about, sir, is actually 6114. It's a series of handwritten notes.
Okay.
When we broke a moment ago, we were talking about Mr. Mearns and Mr. Hartman going down to negotiate with FPU. And this appears to me to be Mr. Hartman's notes related to that particular meeting. And at the top here, there's a listing of George Bachman, Mr. English, Bob Mearns, and G.C. Hartman. And I take that to be a list of attendees, or at least as you sit here today, are you aware of anybody else that would have attended that first in-person meeting with FPU?
I wasn't there. I have no idea.
Sure. And
No,
really my question is just simply, if do you have a recollection as the then mayor of somebody else being dispatched to FPU to meet with them on behalf of the city?
Not on our side, no, sir.
Okay, great. And then as we look down, there's a series of bullet points, and it says water, septem, FPU, and it talks about econ of scale, duplication of service. In the last bullet point, there says 3 occasions, 5-0 vote FPU negotiate purchase. And I think what that's saying is that there was, on 3 occasions, a 5-0 vote on the city commission to go forward with negotiating a purchase from FPU.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall anything like that?
Any votes?
Yes, sir.
They'd be in the minutes.
Okay. So if those votes occurred and there were 5-0 votes on 3 separate occasions to go forward and negotiate an FPU purchase, that you'd expect that to be in the minutes?
Yes, sir.
But you don't have any independent recollection of that?
No, the only recollection I have is that the commission was unanimous in moving forward.
Okay.
Whether it be by consensus at a workshop or a formal action at a meeting. There was no one, there were 2 commissioners that really honed in on a couple different occasions on certain issues, but to move forward with negotiations, it was always unanimous.
Was one of those 2 commissioners you just referenced Mr. Sapp?
Yes.
And who was the other?
Commissioner Rowland asked some pretty pointed questions.
And what is Mr. Sapp's professional background, if you know?
He is a teacher and a department head at the high school.
Okay, and how about Mr. Rowland?
Mr. Rowland is a fire chief with the Jacksonville Fire Department.
Okay.
I believe he's the fire chief. Chief, let's just say a chief, because he works in EMS.
Sure, I understand that. Flipping over to the next, the back page of that 6115, I guess it's the back on mine, the subsequent one on yours. There is, do you see where it says WES, and there's an arrow to 31 million, and then there's a dollar sign, it says price and timing. I'm going to represent to you that as I've looked through this thing, and every time I see WES, it appears to be referring to Bill Sundstrom. Assuming for a moment that Mr. Sundstrom was telling them 31 million, and I think we've already talked about this, that's not something you recall receiving that information back, that that's what they were asking for?
No, and I don't know why this would be in Mr. Mearns' notes. It doesn't appear that Mr. Sundstrom was at this meeting.
Yeah, I wondered that as well. I thought perhaps he had attended by telephone or something of that nature. And then the line below that was $15 million upfront cash. And I guess at the time there in fall of 2002, did City of Fernanidna Beach have the ability to fund $15 million upfront cash in any transaction?
Only through bonds.
Only through bonds. So, to the extent upfront meant a down payment, that wasn't going to happen, correct?
That wasn't going to happen.
Staying in that same exhibit, sir, I'd like you to go to 6146. And ask you to take a look at this page. And again, I'll represent you. This appears to me to be Mr. Hartman's notes. And the first thing, this is it's dated 11/20/02. The first item is City Council approved all 4 contracts. Do you know what he's referring to there?
No, I do not.
Okay. And then next is City Council hired First Southwest Mr. Ed Stoll as the FA and underwriter. Do you know what that means?
Financial advisor.
Okay.
Financial advisor. I'm sorry.
Do you have a recollection of the City Council hiring Ed Stoll?
Yes.
And do you know how he was selected?
I do not recall.
Was Livermore acting as bond counsel at that point?
I do not recall when Livermore came on.
All right. Had the city done work with Ed Stoll before?
I do not recall that either. I know he currently is our financial advisor. Whether he was a financial advisor in 2002, I can't recall.
Mm-hmm. The third item here on this list, it says Deborah Braga is doing the deal, no outside counsel, lawyer, and then it says go, go, go in big letters. And then I can't see what the next, but it says 12-2 and 12-3. What does that mean to you, sir?
What does what mean?
That everything under line item 3, does that spark any recollection for you whatsoever?
Just, to me, it means that we didn't use any outside counsel for the deal. We used internal.
Okay.
And that we were going to try and move forward with the transaction, and Jerry was going to be in Fernandina Beach with the city brief.
And what does that mean, city brief?
Don't know.
Okay. But he was going to be there with it, correct?
He was going to be there with it, according to his notes.
So assuming this is correct, that Deborah Braga is doing the deal and there's no outside counsel working on behalf of the city, would it be your expectation then to the extent of a legal analysis being done of the impact fees that Deborah Braga would have been the one to do it?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to ask you to turn your attention then to 6158.
I'm sorry, again, 6158?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Okay.
And I'm just going to, do you know what the amount of the impact fee as originally passed was?
I believe it was $1,500
And was that per meter or per connection?
per residential connection, ECU or ERC or whatever that terminology is.
We'll have all kinds of acronym fun today, so
Right.
that's, there's a notation here, and frankly, I don't understand how it got on here, but it says FPU/city, and then there's a box, and it says 1,500 / meter REQ, I believe. Or meter, I'm sorry, meter EQ, meter/EQ. Do you have any understanding of what this is trying to communicate?
No, sir, not the slightest.
Okay. You'd agree, though, that at a minimum, this matches what the city adopted, $1,500 per meter equivalent as
I think it
their
actually,
impact fee?
Jerry's calculation came out to $1,499 and some odd cents.
Sure, which we all rounded up to 1,500.
Yes.
And so my question was, does this actually equal what the city ultimately adopted?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then finally, if you turn, I think finally, to 6172. And you see handwritten notes there? Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen this document before?
This document?
Yes, sir.
No.
Okay. And then if you flip on the next page, 6173, it says Summary of Negotiations, 11/15 to 11/18/02. My first question is, do you recognize any of this handwriting?
No, sir.
Do you know what's being communicated here in any way?
No. Do you?
Well, I got a thought. It appears to be a sort of a decision tree back and forth as to what's being exchanged as to the type of deal that might be done with FPU. You got a 7.25, you got 28, 25 plus F, which I take to be futures. You got 18.25, 1,500 per meter. You see all those different markings on there. So my assumption is that this is someone's, presumably Mr. Hartman's, recollections of how the negotiation back and forth with FPU went. And so my first question was just simply, was it anything that you as the mayor had ever been privy to before?
No, sir. And if I was, I couldn't understand what it was anyway.
Sure. And assuming I'm correct for a moment that this really is a recitation of the back and forth and the negotiations that were occurring between FPU and Mr. Hartman and Mr. Mearns, was any of this something that was being reported back to you real time?
I don't recall.
If you could, then just describe for me how active, if at all, you were in the negotiations, call it in the 60 days. And we'll put some timelines down here. I'm going to represent to you, and we'll look at the minutes in a moment, that it was December 3rd, 2002, that the city approved, passed the ordinance resolution to enter into the contract with FPU. And so call it the roughly 2 months prior to that, how active were you, if at all, in the negotiation?
Other than getting verbal updates, I wasn't active at all.
Okay.
That's not my job as a city commissioner or a mayor.
Sure. And to be clear, I'm not trying to necessarily imply that it is your job or that you're in any way derelict in not getting updates. I'm simply trying to get a good understanding of what you recall your participation was and what you knew about what was coming in the transaction. Do you have any recollection in that 60-day window of discussions? You said verbal updates. Were those coming from Mr. Mearns?
Yes.
Do you recall if you got any written updates from him?
I do not recall.
Okay, assuming then it was all verbal updates, do you recall any discussions with Mr. Mearns about in that window of needing to fund any part of the transaction with impact fees?
I don't recall that.
Looking at item 2 on this is 6172, the prior page. Has a figure there of 18.95 million. Mm-hmm. Is that the initial purchase price that was paid by the city?
I can't tell you that. I don't have the exact number in my mind.
Sure. And then there's a series of numbers below that, 8.5 with a 10 to the right, 7.5 to the 7, 7.25 to a 6. Do those numbers mean anything to you?
No.
Do you have a recollection of a component of the purchase price being characterized as futures?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do you recall the dollar amount associated with those futures?
I'm going to say it was around $7 million. And it was a 7-year payout on it.
Sure. And 7 years, we'll look at a document to see what the exact dollar amount was. But when you say there was a 7-year payout, how was the city funding that payout?
I believe part of it was the impact fees collected.
Okay. And at the time, this is dated November 18, 2002. At the time of this, did the city have an ordinance on the books to charge impact fees for potable water?
I do not recall. I mean, we didn't have a water system at the time, so I don't know why we would have one, but in preparation, perhaps we passed an ordinance. I can't recall.
Okay, so you have no recollection of when it was relative to
sir.
the transaction that the impact fee ordinance was passed. Would it be a true statement that in the absence of those impact fees, well, maybe another way of looking at this, we've talked a number of different times, come back to the question whether or not the system paid for itself. Would you agree that the amount that was being pledged as futures to be paid to FPU, that was not accounted for in the initial bond, correct?
That is correct.
So whatever money was going to be paid to them as part of the futures, you couldn't go to the fund of the bond and say, yep, I'll get it from here.
That is correct.
Could you go to 6278, please? And what I'm interested in this document, sir,
I'm sorry, 6278?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry about that. That's the last page.
On the top of the page, again, it's WES, and it says, yes, we will need someone on AIU condemnation. Does that spark any recollection or information for you as to what that might mean?
Well, we were interested in acquiring the AIU system at the time.
Okay.
Again, I think I've stated earlier that I don't know if we had the power to condemn that or not, since it was outside of our municipality.
Okay. Do you recall whether or not the city would have received a legal opinion as to whether or not they had the ability to condemn it at that time?
I do not recall.
If you had received a legal opinion, who would you have expected that to come from?
I don't have the slightest idea.
At a minimum, would you have expected Deborah Braga to have initiated the process for getting a legal opinion on that?
I would assume that's who we would have asked to, yes.
I'll represent to you that I don't find anywhere in these notes that Mr. Hartman took of the back and forth. He references Mr. Mearns, he references people from FPU. I don't see any reference to Deborah Braga participating. Do you have any indication or recollection today that Deborah Braga was active in the negotiation?
I don't have any recollection whether she was or she wasn't active in the negotiation.
Okay.
Again, as elected officials, we set policy. We don't get into the nuts and bolts, and this is truly nuts and bolts.
Okay. And again, I don't challenge the idea that it's nuts and bolts. I'm simply, as we've acknowledged, it was the largest transaction going on at the time, obviously a pretty significant for the city to be getting into the water utility business.
Sure.
Recognizing it's in the wastewater business, but this was a new area, correct?
Absolutely.
And so I may ask some questions that may be different than what you would have expected the norm for as an elected official, just to see what you recall.
That's fair.
The next thing I'd like you to look at, we're going to hand you Exhibit 27.
I don't believe this has an exhibit number on it. So y'all can figure that out.
That's 26.
That was 26.
26.
Okay.
It's not marked on there.
I think it just got flipped over. Or is it? Okay. Should have been.
I think I got the original.
Aha! I had my suspicions. Did you mark it at all, Susan? Okay, I guess I could certainly substitute. 27. Let me just ask you to take a quick look at this. I am guessing this is something you have not seen before.
Well, I'm not saying that I haven't seen it, I don't recall seeing it.
Sure. Appears to be an internal document where Mr. Jerry Hartman is communicating with Jennifer Woodall of his office. The interesting thing to me, if you would look at 6072, and they're at number 18, it appears to me that this document is Mr. Hartman providing comments to a proposal to go back to FPU to purchase the system. I guess my first question, we've already talked about how the futures component of the purchase price was to be funded in part with impact fees. Do you know who first introduced the concept of impact fees, or even the futures component, into the, let me ask it a little bit better. Do you know who introduced the futures concept into the negotiation?
No, I do not.
Do you know who first raised the issue of paying for a portion of this with impact fees?
No, I do not.
I'm guessing from that answer it wasn't you in either account. Is that correct?
Not that I can recall.
Okay. So if you did it, you don't remember it?
Exactly.
All right. Looking at Mr., and I guess looking at Mr. Hartman's notes here at 918, it says FPU shall receive $1,000 for each new connection/meter set for the next 10 years. Payments by the city shall be quarterly. The $1,000 per meter payment is limited to FPU's existing certificated area. I think it's FPIC, if I'm not mistaken, or FPUC.
PSC, Public
FP.
Services.
Okay.
Public Service Commission.
Well, we're going to blame that on Mr. Hartman's handwriting. Could you tell me, please, do you recall receiving any kind of contemporaneous communication? You indicated verbal updates from Mr. Mearns that as of November 8, 2002, the city was talking about extending the payments out through these, making payments to FPU on a connection per meter basis?
Do I remember any conversations about that?
Were you receiving it? You're the mayor, and again, I recognize that you're trusting your staff to do quite a bit, but do you recall receiving any communication, either from Mr. Mearns or anyone else, that as of November 8, 2002, the city was introducing the concept of making additional payments to FPU other than the initial purchase price based on a meter per connection payment?
The only thing that I really remember about the futures price was that it would be stretched out over 7 years, and whatever was left over would be due to FPU at the end of 7 years.
Okay.
If you're asking me how I thought about that, after 7 years we would have some interest and equity in the system, and if we needed to go out and bond, we would probably have the strength to do that.
Okay. So in terms of what you were thinking about at the time with the futures payment was that by the time the money would come due, you likely could borrow that from someplace else?
Yes, we could float a bond if necessary. Quite frankly, nobody saw what would happen to the economy in really started here in 2006, so I'm sure that left a little bit of a bigger hole than was anticipated.
Sure. You mentioned on the futures payment that if it's not covered by impact fees, it was still an obligation of the city, correct? And I know you testified it was $7 million. We're going to look at some other documents. I'm going to represent to you with $7.5 million.
That could very well be.
But for purpose of our discussion, assuming it's $7.5 million, whatever wasn't covered by impact fees, the city still had to pay it to FPU, correct?
No, absolutely, yes.
And as I look at the transaction notes here, item 18, it appears to be a slightly different structure. It appears that what they're talking about there is if we get $1,000 per connection, that's what we pay to FPU. It's a pass-through, as opposed to an obligation for a set amount. Do you recall any discussion?
I can't speak to whatever your interpretation of these notes are. I wasn't privy to them, nor do I recall any discussions in that regard.
Okay. I'm going to represent to you that the City Commission took up the proposed contract with FPU on December 3rd, 2002. Mm-hmm. Do you have any recollection of receiving information, briefing, anything prior to that meeting as to what the terms and conditions of the deal were?
Oh, I'm sure we were. We're given documentation regarding that.
So you're sure you would have gotten it, but you have no recollection of what that might have consisted of?
I don't recall. And quite frankly, I don't recall if we approved the contract at that meeting, or if we were given the contract, discussed it, and given time, and came back. I don't. Mm-hmm. The timeline is not clear in my mind at all.
Okay. Would you agree if the contract was actually signed one day after the meeting, chances are that you approved the contract as written?
I would assume that, yes.
And just sticking with this same point, independent of my interpretation of these notes, would you agree it's a different type of transaction if what the city is committing to is to pass through whatever they receive for meter connections, as opposed to a set amount to be funded in part by payments funded by meter connections?
That's your assumption, it's not mine. I don't know what these notes are telling me or saying. This is the first time I've seen it.
Sure, and again, ignore the notes for a moment.
Okay.
If City of Fernanidna Beach committed to pay FPU a futures payment that was equal to $1,000 per connection over the next 5 years, and we're just using that number as a hypothetical. So over the next 5 years, if they got 1,000 connections, each at $1,000, the obligation is $1 million, correct?
If that's what your formula is.
Okay.
It's not my formula, and I don't recall that.
I understand that, but I'm just trying to see how you understand the transaction. We agree that the city's obligation to FPU was $7.5 million, correct?
Yes, sir. I'll agree
Under
with
the
that.
futures component.
Yes.
If not a single person connected to that system in the 7 years after the city purchased from FPU, what would the city's obligation to FPU be?
$7.5 million.
So it's always a hard number, correct?
Yes, sir.
Doesn't change. And regardless of whether it's my interpretation or not, would you agree that it would be a very different transaction in terms of the city's obligation if all they had to pay was whatever they collected in their impact fees? So we're going to set an impact fee for $1,000. If we collect 1, you get 1,000 FPU. If you collect 100, you get 100,000. There's no. That's a different transaction, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Sure it is.
And so again, going back to what you may or may not have been told leading up to approval of the contract with FPU in early December, do you have any recollection of receiving information that the negotiations went from a pass-through of what is collected on equivalent meter connections versus a hard number, like the $7.5 million total?
No, I don't recall anything
Okay.
of that.
Is that the type of thing that would have concerned you to have learned?
I think that I stated previously that, no, I mean, I didn't, first of all, I don't recall anything about $1,000 per connection over a period of time. don't recall any of that. And I think I stated previously to you that whatever the transaction was on the futures payment at $7.5 million, whatever we didn't pay down in 7 years, we would have equity in the system and probably be very capable of bonding any remaining debt,
Okay.
if necessary.
So at least to the best of your recollection, then, to the extent you had concerns about the futures, it was limited to the fact that it could still be paid with debt even if it wasn't paid with impact fees. Is that a fair characterization?
That's a fair characterization.
Okay.
Sure.
Can I have 28, please? And Ms. Trudy one that does not have a sticker on it.
Thank you.
I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit 28 to your deposition. And I should take a look at it and tell me first if you've ever seen this document before.
If I have seen it, I do not recall.
Okay. It indicates by its terms in the second paragraph, this letter constitutes the commitment of Florida Public Utilities Company to exclusively negotiate with the City of Fernandina Beach and its representatives for the potential sale of the FPU-owned water system on Amelia Island and Fernandina Beach. And it appears from the fax notations at the top that it would have gone from Florida Public Utilities, and then later there's a fax notation from Hartman and Associates. I guess my first question is, do you recall whether or not FPU was exclusively negotiating with the City of Fernandina Beach?
I do not recall.
That's not information you would have received at the time?
If I received it, I don't recall it.
Okay. Would you agree, though, that if FPU had committed to exclusively negotiate with Fernandina Beach, essentially Fernandina Beach did not have any competition for this transaction?
I guess that's what the letter says.
Sure. I mean, either they'd get a deal or they wouldn't, but they were not at risk of somebody else swooping in to buy it underneath them, correct?
At this particular point, I think that's correct.
All right. I was curious, given the fact that this is a commitment to the City of Fernandina Beach, it appears to have been directed only to Jerry Hartman. Do you know why that would be?
No, sir, I do not.
Doesn't appear to be copied to Bob Mearns or Deborah Braga. So that's not something that you have any thoughts on?
No, sir.
Okay. Do you think it's possible that this was directed to Mr. Hartman as opposed to the city to avoid any public records obligations?
I wouldn't have the slightest idea how to answer that.
Okay. So you have no thoughts on that one way or the other?
No, I can't imagine it would. No. I have no thoughts on it.
Did Mr. Hartman have the authority to bind the city?
No, only the city commission can bind the city.
All right. And at least as you sit here today, you don't recall whether or not you were informed at the time as the mayor and a city commissioner that FPU had committed to exclusive negotiations?
I do not recall.
Sitting here today, we've got, if you look at the third paragraph, this is exclusive negotiation letter, at least according to the fax notations, it was delivered on 11/5 of 2002. And it says that the parties need to have executed a purchase and sale agreement by December 1, 2002. Does that give you any concern that a transaction of this size and complexity was being pushed on that kind of timeline?
No. I recall that FPU was going to, trying to get into the natural gas business, and from what I remember about the negotiations at the time is they wanted the capital available to make a push into natural gas, and that's why they were willing to sell the water utility.
Okay. So you recall what FPU's intentions were, that they wanted money for a natural gas expansion.
Yes, sir.
And again, recognizing that may have been FPU's interest in the transaction, it doesn't in any way give you pause that the city was trying to do that, a transaction that they've never done before, purchasing a water utility, that it's the largest transaction ongoing, and that it's going to need to be done in, what, about a 25-day window with Thanksgiving in between?
Well, if I recall correctly from our discussions today, we started talking about acquiring the water system sometime in June. And we actually didn't close on it till the middle to the end of March. So I don't think 10 months is really rushing into something.
Okay. So you feel like the 10-month window kind of fairly captures the time spent by the city in analyzing the deal?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And we agreed a moment ago that the $7.5 million, that was a hard number, correct? You had to pay it regardless of whether or not anybody signed up for future connections.
Yes, sir.
And if you add that to the amount of cash that was paid at closing, and I'm going to represent to you that the total between the two is actually $26.45 million.
Okay.
And I'm also going to represent to you that that was a contract that was approved by the City Commission, I believe on December 2nd of 2002. And I guess my question is this. You attended a workshop in September of 2002 where the outside consultant and someone that's been represented to you as sort of the expert on utility acquisition has told you that his ballpark figure for the acquisition is $12.2 million. Less than 3 months later, the city is committing to pay $26.45 million for it. Do you have any recollection of any concerns about the amount that you were then being required to pay for it, given the expectations that were set during the early parts of the negotiation and the city's due diligence?
No, sir, I did not.
Can you think of any other transaction where the price more than doubled in such a short time frame on such a significant matter that the city went forward with the transaction?
No, sir, but I can tell you my major concern was that the city's revenues that they realized from the system would pay the debt service that was incurred. And that is the case. And in addition to that, we were able to maintain the same water rates for 5 years, which was actually a pretty amazing feat for our customers. So I didn't have any concerns about it. Again, if you wanted to talk about the $7.5 million future payment, my feeling was at the time, when we got to 7 years, whatever the balance was, we would have enough equity in the system that we would be able to, if necessary, go out and bond or borrow additional funds to cover that.
Based on what you just said, then, would it be a fair statement that you would have been happy with any purchase price, or you would have found any purchase price acceptable so long as it could have been 100% financed with debt?
As long as it met the bond covenants, that's what was important to me.
Okay, so be it $26 million, $30 million, $35 million, all that really mattered was that if the revenues associated with the system and the presumed equity that would occur over the next time period of whatever futures were agreed to, as long as that was something that the city had the capacity to pay for with bond proceeds, that was okay with you?
As long as the revenue generated from the system paid the debt on the bonds, I was content with the purchase price.
Okay. All right. Was that communicated to Mr. Mearns, that your view of that?
I don't recall.
How about Mr. Hartman?
I do not recall.
Could I have 30, please?
Yeah.
And my question to you on this one, Mr. Gerrity, is looks like a one-page letter and attached, or two-page letter with attachments that detail the current state of the negotiations as of November 12, 2002. It's from Hartman and Associates to George Bachman at FPU. And copied on there is Mr. Mearns and two people from Hartman and Associates, and then an attorney representing FPU. And my first question, sir, is have you ever seen this before?
Not to my recollection.
All right. Recognizing that you may not have seen it at the time, sitting here today, are you surprised that there's no attorney on copy for the city?
Doesn't surprise me.
And are you at all familiar with Mr. Sundstrom?
He's an attorney, I believe, that represented FPU in the transaction.
I'm going to represent to you that Mr. Sundstrom is very experienced in utility transactions and providing legal advice associated with those. Sitting here today, do you have any concern that the city was negotiating with an experienced utility acquisition attorney and the city's own attorney isn't even on copy?
No, sir, I have to tell you, I'm very happy with the way the transaction was handled and the way it's turned out 10 years later.
So nothing about the process bothers you?
No, sir.
Would you agree that as an elected official, even if you have the ability to fund an acquisition with debt, would you agree that you have an obligation to try to get the best deal possible for the City of Fernanidna Beach?
Absolutely.
And so even though you're happy with the transaction as the way it turned out, let's say you got it for $5 million less than the city did pay for it. Would you have been happier then?
Probably not.
Probably not.
I mean, you know,
Okay.
of course
No,
you're
that's
going to be
fine.
happy if you get it a little cheaper, but you know, it's, again, I'm happy, very happy with the way the transaction turned out. It was, when you can tell your citizens that you're not going to raise your water rates for them on 5 years, when FPU has tripled their, or doubled their electric rates in that same time, you're giving your customers a pretty good benefit there.
Were the rates, correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't the rates have been regulated through the Public Service Commission in the hands
I
of?
don't believe so.
You don't believe so? Okay. So without the city without the city having acquired the utility from FPU could charge whatever it wanted for rates?
I'm not really sure what their ability to charge, and I'm not sure who regulated them.
Do you have any recollection of whether